Good morning, everybody. I guess we'll get started. Zoomers, you're muted. Please stay muted. At the end, you can put your questions in the chat and I'll monitor that. If you're in this room and you have a cell phone, I'd greatly appreciate it if you would silence it so it doesn't go off during our talk. And Bob Bernstein is here and who will introduce our speaker for today.
It's a pleasure to have the St. John's Riverkeeper here. Lisa and I have crawled around in the river together a few times. She has served as the chief advocate and public voice for the St. John's River. She utilizes 20 years of policy experience to hold those harming the river accountable and to identify champion solutions to protect and restore the river, its tributaries, and its many springs. And I might remind you that it's 310 miles long, and I think of it as a river of many rivers. It's really different in different places. She works with government entities, businesses, community leaders, and citizens to help resolve problems that impact the river's health. And she communicates with the media and the public to educate and raise awareness about important river-related issues. And Lisa was instrumental in the creation of the Waterkeepers of Florida, a formal collaboration of 15 Waterkeeper Alliance programs across the state. She is also one of the founding members of the Reunite the Rivers Coalition, working to reunite Silver Springs, the Ocklawaha, and the St. John's as the Great Florida Riverway. It's a big story. One of the issues there, of course, is Rodman Dam. And she actually gets out on the river and even in the river to monitor submerged grasses there. She enjoys Florida waterways and natural wonders with her husband, Mark, and two teenage boys, Mark Jr. and August. And welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob, and thank you all for joining me this morning to talk about my favorite subject, the St. John's River. My name is Lisa Rinaman, and I've been in this role for 12 years now. And I'm real excited that we as an organization just celebrated 25 years of giving the St. John's River a voice. And it does have economic value. So that makes our job easier on one hand because there is a true return on investment that we can talk about. But really what makes this work meaningful and impactful is citizen engagement. And so working with people like you who care to give the St. John's River, its tributaries, its lakes, a voice. So we're going to just jump right in. Our offices are at Jacksonville University, just north of this or downstream from this scene going through downtown Jacksonville. But as Bob mentioned, the St. John's River is 310 miles long. So before it even gets to this point, there's a lot of work to be done to make sure we're protecting the St. John's River as much as possible. Let's see if I can. I'm sorry. There we go. So here's the St. John's River watershed. It is the second largest ecosystem in the state of Florida next to the Everglades. It's about 8,800 square miles, which covers 16% of the state of Florida. So it's a really big area. Let's see if I can figure out how to do the pointer. There we go. The blue star right here is in Indian River County. The river begins just west of Vero Beach, and it starts traveling north at that point, that 310-mile journey. One of the most unique things about the St. John's, it only drops in elevation about 27 feet over that 310-mile journey, and most of that's in the first 100 miles here in Indian River County, Brevard, and Osceola counties. And so since it only drops in elevation 27 feet that whole journey, it makes it a very slow moving river. It's very lazy, so when things go in, it sticks around for a long time. It also swells into lakes when it hits a low area, and it's known as the River of Lakes. And there's a wonderful book by Bill Belleville called River of Lakes that recounts his paddle all 310 miles. The green star right here is the confluence of the Ocklawaha River and the St. John's. That's the beginning of the St. John's River estuary. And so the Ocklawaha River and its health is extremely important to the estuary of the St. John's. The red star is where we are sitting right here in Gainesville, which is part of the St. Johns River watershed. Since the fact that it is a spring-fed river. There's about 100 freshwater springs that feed that critical fresh water into the St. Johns, and the yellow star is where our offices are in Jacksonville University. But for us to truly protect the St. Johns, we have to work with throughout this entire watershed with people that care as well as organizations that do great work to protect all these natural systems. Our river will sustain us, but we must sustain our river. And that's what our work is all about. It is an economic driver through all the communities that are fortunate enough to live in the St. Johns River watershed. But it is important that we invest in our river. A healthy river drives a healthy economy. A dirty river full of toxic blue-green algae can undermine the economic health. And that was really apparent in downtown Jacksonville back in the 60s before the Clean Water Act. Most of the building on the river was not buildings that needed to be there. It's public buildings because the river was so polluted, people didn't want to live on the St. Johns. Luckily, things have changed, but we have a lot more work to do. When we first were founded in 1999, there was about 5 million people that lived in the St. Johns River watershed. Now there's more than 9 million. And so it's critically important that we all do our part. We've been able to work with people and use the Clean Water Act to clean up some of the big pollutants, some of the big pipes. But the non-source point pollution is much more difficult. And so we have to all do our part as individuals to reduce our pollution footprint, but also work with agriculture, work with governments to make sure we have policies in place to slow down pollution going into these waterways, our groundwaters, our springs, as well as our surface waters. Part of the big problem is fertilizer use, both urban as well as agricultural, because the things that we put on our yard to keep our yards green, they also turn our river green. And far too often we see these toxic, harmful algal outbreaks that make our river unusable, and it makes it not only harmful for us, but also wildlife, and does much other harm to the St. Johns River itself. When you have a blue-green algae outbreak like this one, it makes it, you don't want to take your boat out. In fact, marinas have had to shut down. Hotels have had to, not allow people to come, because not only is this toxic to you, if you touch it in the water, it can also go airborne and have significant impact. So it truly is, undermines economies in several different ways, not to mention reduction in property values. One time I received a phone call from someone on the Indian River Lagoon when they were having outbreaks and they were wanting to sell their property and move to the St. Johns, but she wanted to make sure that we didn't have toxic blue-green algae blooms, and I had to tell her the truth that unfortunately we do, but we're doing our part to try to reduce these impacts. Not only does excess nutrients cause toxic blue-green algae outbreaks, those mats can also block sunlight, and we can lose habitat, and that can undermine our commercial and recreational fisheries. So it's not just, for those that want to get on the water, it truly has a trickle effect all into different parts of our economy. But we do believe that it is valuable, and luckily, as I mentioned, we have the numbers we're going to go through in just a moment. But it fuels our mission to defend and protect and restore the St. Johns River and its tributaries. And it's not just the main stem of the river. Our river is only as healthy as its springs. I'm excited to see Bob Palmer over there with the Florida Springs Council doing great work to protect our springs, as well as our tributaries and all the land within our watershed. We can protect our land, and we can protect our freshwater swamps, our springs, our tributaries. Then we can fulfill our mission to defend and restore the St. Johns River. Fortunately, back in 2014, so these numbers are a little outdated, but the University of North Florida conducted an economic study of the lower St. Johns River. So these numbers are just looking at all the economic impact from the lower St. Johns, from the confluence of the Ocklawaha River, just south of Willaca, all the way down to the mouth downstream to the mouth at Mayport. And so the study found that there is a significant impact on an annual basis of billions of dollars for taxpayers, residents, and everyone that's lucky enough to live within the watershed. The wetlands alone are worth $3.5 billion. Oh, and this is on an annual basis, and this comes in the form of flood control. There's $3 billion in savings for flood prevention. That equals to 15,000 per homeowner in the lower St. Johns River. So it's very significant. Also, it exceeds 400 million per year for nitrogen removal and 5.3 million for phosphorus removal. Nitrogen and phosphorus, those are the two nutrients that are really driving these toxic, harmful algal outbreaks. If these wetlands aren't doing the job, then governments have to invest in trying to remove this, utilities and others. So there really is a huge impact. That's why we continuously to fight to protect wetlands. There's a lot of mitigation conversations about mitigating wetlands to allow developers to fill and kill these wetlands more easily. But sometimes they allow them to mitigate for wetland loss in a basin further away. And so you lose all of these ecosystem services that provide flood protection as well as nutrient reduction, but another community may get them. There's also some funny accounting with mitigation baking, which it's always not a like for like. And so it's really troubling where it's more of an accounting paper exercise, and Florida is losing a troubling amount of wetlands. We recently challenged the federal government right at the end of in 2020, at the end of the first Trump administration. The federal government actually delegated wetlands permitting to the state of Florida. And with that delegation, wetlands lost important federal protections in the Clean Water Act as well as the Endangered Species Act. Fortunately, we were represented with other environmental organizations by Earth Justice. We won the lawsuit, and the judge immediately sent the permitting responsibility back to the federal government and restored the federal protections. And that is in place today. However, the state of Florida is appealing. We will be back in court on May the 5th. But right now, we've won every administrative hurdle they put in front of us. But now 17 other states have joined the state of Florida challenging us, and Congressman Aaron Bean is trying to codify Florida's delegation. So we have significant hurdles, but I'm thankful we have a great legal team, and the judges so far have been working in wetlands' favor and Florida's favor. So I say Florida as far as us as citizens' favor, so we'll continue that effort. But stay tuned for what we find out after we go to court on May the 5th. Riverfront properties. This is another huge economic driver and influence of the river. Properties that have riverfront access on the St. Johns River have a $944 million increased value. If on tributary properties, all the homes that live on Black Creek or Julington Creek, on Doctors Lake or many of the other tributaries, they have a $117 million advantage over properties that do not have tributary frontage. Also just properties within proximity, within walking distance that have access to our waterways were documented to have an $837 million increased value. And this generated more than $136 million in taxes over 20 years. So these are real economic numbers. It's not just ecosystem services that some economists say are soft numbers. These are really hard numbers that have been able to be generated by the University of North Florida. And then, of course, there's recreation. I just put a bunch of fishing photos, but it's more than just fishing. It's boating, it's sightseeing, it's bird watching. It's people coming to areas along with parks and investing in riverside restaurants, but a significant annual impact of up to $109 million. There are other economic concerns or entities that are along the St. Johns River. We work very closely with Jacksport, which is the major port in Jacksonville, and we have an ongoing debate. Jacksport likes to say that the reason Jacksonville is where it's located is because that's where the port is located. I believe that the reason Jacksport and Jacksonville is where they're located is because it's the St. Johns River. The St. Johns River was here first, and it's what attracted many people before us and will continue to attract people to Jacksonville. The challenge with the port being located at the mouth of St. John's, this facility right here is about 10 miles from the mouth at Mayport, and the Army Corps of Engineers for the last 100 years have been deepening and dredging and straightening the river to create a super highway for larger vessels to come into the port. And while they've done that, they've also created a super highway for the Atlantic Ocean to come further inland. On average, this area was the depth of this part of the river was about 12 feet. And there were sandbars. There were all these natural features that protected the community from the Atlantic Ocean. It regulated how much the Atlantic Ocean came in. But as you remove those sandbars and you cut straighter pathways and remove all the curves and make it deeper, it gives the Atlantic Ocean more tidal force to come further inland. And that increases saltwater intrusion further inland as well as raises water levels. The tide range of the St. Johns has more than doubled since dredging began 100 years ago. And after this last dredging that was completed in 2018, there's been a significant increase where water levels are higher in the St. Johns. The Army Corps projected there would be an increase to 6 to 8 inches in some areas on high frequency storms, so not just hurricanes, and we're starting to see the impact of that. We actually challenged this permit trying to get mitigation, and unfortunately we didn't win the challenge, and the whole debate was over, is a 6 to 8 inch increase in water levels, is that significant or insignificant? When you live in an area that is flat as Florida with a river as flat as the St. Johns, it's significant, and unfortunately we're seeing the impact of this water increase as we speak. Also, that water's bringing more saltwater intrusion. We're seeing more and more saltwater going further inland, and the extremes of this impact of having more fresh water, more saltwater at a higher frequency, it's really doing damage to submerged grasses as well as wetlands and submerged freshwater forest. But the Army Corps only looks at averages. And if you look at the average, it's like putting your head in the oven and putting your feet in the freezer and saying on average you're doing okay. But it's really causing harm to these grasses. And again, some of the fun times Bob and I have had running around in the river looking at these grasses, it's showing it's putting stress along with other stressors. We also had a wake-up call with Hurricane Irma. This is downtown Jacksonville in 2017. And the models did not project this type of flooding. They knew there was a flood risk, but everyone was shocked by the amount of flooding we had in downtown Jacksonville, in other urban neighborhoods, and Black Creek. And part of it, we believe, is because there's a new normal, and they're looking. So we're having to look at new flood maps, looking at compound flooding. The river's getting so high that there's nowhere for the water to go down the storm drains, and taking into account all these different types of flooding at the same time. In addition, this water that was in the St. Johns stuck around for a much longer time than we anticipated. During Hurricane Irma, there was about 22 trillion gallons of water that fell into the St. Johns River watershed, and that water was stacked into the St. Johns for a longer period of time. And the water was higher and darker, and that did additional damage to the submerged grasses, which are so important to the St. Johns River. In fact, after Hurricane Irma, some of the documentation that Bob and others did demonstrate that we lost nearly more than 90% of the submerged aquatic vegetation in the lower St. Johns, which is critical habitat to our fisheries and also to manatees. Hurricanes have come through our area before and wiped out grasses, and all the agencies weren't that concerned about this loss because they projected that they would come back in 2 years. Well, 2 years came back, the grasses didn't come back. 3 years, 4 years. And so we all were very concerned and realized we had to elevate this conversation because these grasses, they are the kidneys of the St. Johns. They provide filtration. They're important habitat. And the loss of them not only undermines the river's health, but also our economy that's driven by recreational and commercial fishery. So we launched our Save Our Rivers Grasses campaign. We did intentionally have 2 logos because these grasses are very important to fishermen as well as manatee enthusiasts and advocates. And we wanted to really demonstrate that these grasses are important to both groups. Sometimes bass fishermen and manatee environmentalists don't really get along because there was a long-lived debate not only on the Rodman Dam, which we'll talk about in a moment, but also on speed zones. Speed zones were a very important tool to slow down boats so we could protect our manatees. In fact, they were critical in bringing our manatees back. We thought we were going to lose our manatee population when they were less than 1,000 in Florida. And luckily, thanks to speed zones and other protections, they are coming back. but now they're experiencing some challenges due to loss of habitat, like the freshwater grasses in the St. John's. So we actually are bringing these groups together. We have times where we're getting in the river together. There's some bass fishermen that they have T-shirts that say "Save our grasses, eat a manatee." We don't advocate for those shirts, so we're giving them these shirts to hopefully that they can start wearing something that's a little more friendly to all of our partners. But this campaign started with basically getting back to the river and getting into the river and just documenting what's happening. The agencies were measuring the grasses, but they weren't looking at water quality and measuring the grass growth at the same places in the same time. And so we wanted to bring not only the water quality data, but also get in the water, measure the grasses, see how fast they're growing, look at the density, looking at the height. And we did so by partnering with riverfront homeowners. In fact, we're actually partnered with Eric Marzoff, who lives in Bob's home there in East Palatka. But getting in there we do this measurement and this monitoring 3 times every year. And so creating not only a record of what's going on behind these homes, but actually new relationships up and down the St. Johns River. When we first arrive at a dock, we do water quality data. We look at salinity, we look at dissolved oxygen, turbidity, temperature, pH, and then we jump in the river and look for grasses. The first couple trips out, some of the spots had 0 grasses, and they were in areas with high salinity. But I'm happy to report we are finding grasses at every one of our sites. We currently have 15 sites over that 80-mile stretch from Doctors Lake to Lake George. Unfortunately, the grasses are very short. They almost look like a lawnmower has mowed them down, where these grasses should be long, up the length of my arm. And so we're really troubled about the shortness of it. And what we're seeing is the grasses are getting grazed on by hungry turtles and manatees. And they're hungry. They prefer these grasses. And so something's going on where these grasses are succumbing to grazing pressure more quickly than they have historically. The Florida Fish and Wildlife started a program where they started installing protective enclosures to protect these grasses from grazers, not to keep them out to keep them hungry, but just to see if the grass would grow if they had a little protection. And the good news is the grasses can come back under current conditions. And so this is a point. This was Dancy Point. It's in East Palatka, and you can see the grasses. That's what the grasses should look like in the St. John's, where they're topping out, and so they can grow back. But what the data is showing us is the grasses are growing more slowly than they have historically, and we believe that's causing them to succumb to grazing pressure more quickly. And so we need to relieve stress on these grasses to allow them to flourish and grow and spread. So one of the next steps for our work is we're putting small enclosures like this at 10 different locations from Doctors Lake to Lake George to see if we can gather more data to advocate for more solutions to reduce stress on these grasses, allowing them to get more sunlight. One of the things we've learned over the last 2 years of doing this work is when there's more salt water in the system, these grasses actually need more sunlight. And it's a time we're seeing higher water and darker water where they're getting less sunlight. And so the stress is starting to accumulate, and we need to figure out ways to relieve that stress. But this has created a new bond and a new relationship, not only with riverfront homeowners that allow us to use their docks and their riverfront property to do this work, but also with fishermen. And starting to look at the science and look at the data in different ways, as well as a community conversation. We have a series of brewery talks taking this information to the community, and every one time we have one, they're packed. And people really want to understand what we can do about these submerged grasses, whether they're a fisherman or a homeowner, they care about water quality, or they care about manatees. So it's been a really great partnership. And it's reunited a conversation around the benefits of reuniting Silver Springs, the Ocklawaha, and the St. John's. This is one of the most impactful tools that we have available to us to restore the lower St. John's River. And this is as important to this part of the state as Everglades restoration is to the South Florida. So we're very excited to have new partners trying to make this happen and getting closer every day. Silver Springs was actually the first Disney World of Florida. It was the tourist attraction of the state of Florida long before Disney. And people, they actually would come to Jacksonville, they'd go to Palatka. Palatka had wonderful hotels, and then they would get on a steamboat and go all the way up the Ocklawaha. And so this was an economic driver in its heyday, not only from a tourism perspective, but also from a fishing perspective. Putnam County was known as the bass fishing capital of the world long before the Rodman Dam was ever put in. And so we really want to focus on restoring the St. Johns River ability to continue to provide freshwater as well as saltwater fishing into the future. And bring back this tourism. If you haven't been to downtown Palatka or Willatka lately, you haven't been to those areas, they're really starting to thrive and bringing back ecotourism as well as heritage tourism, really focusing on William Bartram's travels and all the history that is that Palatka and Willatka is lucky to have. We were just there this weekend at the Bartram Frolic, and it was thriving with people from all over the state as well as the Southeast coming to really understand the beauty, the ruralness, and the history of this connection. While we don't see these on the Ocklawaha anymore, you do see a lot of boats, people coming back and checking into it. And part of the opportunity is to bring back springs. There's 20 springs that right now are not flowing as part of the Ocklawaha system. This was Blue Springs. And Florida, actually, Field and Stream magazine wrote an article, a very sad article, saying goodbye to this spring before the Rodman Dam went in, because this was such a popular fishing destination before it was flooded out by the Rodman Dam. But Silver Springs is the largest freshwater spring that provides that critical fresh water to the St. Johns River. But the natural connection was severed in the 60s as part of the failed Cross Florida Barge Canal. This was a canal that was going to actually be built across the state of Florida, similar to the Panama Canal, but President Nixon stopped it in 1972 because of the significant outcry of concern, not only from environmentalists about the loss of these springs, but also by farmers concerned about their water supply as well as just the cost. It was a huge boondoggle at the time. Unfortunately, the Rodman Dam, also known as the Kirkpatrick Dam, was already in place, and it remains there today. And part of it is because the pool behind the dam, the large-looking lake area there, became a popular bass fishing destination, but it's never functioned as a natural lake. In fact, it has to be drained every 3 to 4 years to clean it out because of significant invasive plants that block all of the use, so people can't use it, they can't get out. It also can suck oxygen out of the lake, and then they do heavy herbicide spraying, and that kills these plants, adds more nutrient pollution, and so it's really a mess. And when they drain this, it has a significant pollution plume to the St. Johns River, and when they fill it back up, there's a significant saltwater spike because they cut off all water going to the St. Johns River. And so it's a really big problem. During the drawdown, it gives us a glimpse into what the Ocklawaha looked like in its day. The historic channel is still there, and you can see the forested floodplain, the trees that were just basically knocked down and drowned out. They start reappearing, and the springs start flowing again. And so during the drawdown, there's been significant research by federal and state agencies to be able to really determine what restoration would look like, as well as the University of Florida has done a significant economic study to make not only the environmental case, but the economic case for restoring the Ocklawaha River and reuniting these water bodies. On the environmental side, it'll restore 150 million gallons of fresh water a day on average back into the lower Ocklawaha and St. Johns River system. That fresh water will definitely help offset saltwater intrusion, and that water's clearer and cooler. It's more like spring water as opposed to the warmer water that comes out of the dam after it leaks out, and it's only about 50% of the flow by the time it gets through the Rodman Dam. That helps sustain the 100-mile St. Johns River estuary as well as those submerged grasses in the lower St. Johns. Not to mention it restores significant habitat, not only for manatees, it provides warm water in the wintertime as well as cooler water and more grazing opportunities in the summertime, but it also opens up migratory fish patterns and restores opportunities for some of these fish that were once caught in the Ocklawaha and St. John's to come back. And then over There's about more than 1,700 acres of forested floodplain. About 8,000 of that is flooded underneath the pool. That will come back, so it provides floodplain and opportunity to not only protect from flooding from downstream communities, but also filter out. They're the best biofilters that a river can have. And then it will restore the lower Ocklawaha watershed as well. But we're here to talk economics today. So what are the economics? Again, this was a multi-year study by University of Florida, and they project based on not only increased fishing, but other types of visitation. There'll be a 28% change in regional visitation. So you have more people coming to the area. There's a savings of more than $4 million from repair and maintenance on the dam. The dam is 50 years old. It has significant issues and needs to be replaced, as well as the Buckman Lock, which is the lock that allows boats to come in, has significant issues and is continuously killing manatees, which is why it's closed right now. You can't even get through it. That will have an $8.1 million economic impact by this restoration and a 7.6% return on investment. It's these numbers that have now gotten businessmen and women and elected officials in Putnam and Marion County supporting this effort, as well as politicians in Tallahassee. And there's actually movement as we speak to fund the first step of this restoration, this legislative session. As I mentioned, bass fishermen as well as saltwater fishermen up and down the St. Johns River are now advocating for this because they want to make sure they're doing everything they can to protect their lifestyle for their children as well as future generations. And so lucky to be working with many fishermen and women along the St. Johns River. And there is a business case for this restoration, and that's why you see so many business people within these counties at Ground Zero supporting this at this point. Part of the focus has been changing the conversation from what will be lost to what will be gained, and working with community to reimagine the dam, because the dam will still be there. It will just be breached at the natural channel. We're really focusing on reimagining the dam. And this is a rendering after several community meetings talking to residents about what they want to see there. So you could actually literally take your boat from Palatka to Willatka and stop at the dam, and there'll be fishing piers, there'll be viewing piers, there'll be areas for kids to play and really experience seeing this forest come back over time. And then looking at all the different ecosystems over the years, it's not going to be a mud hole once they drain the pool. It actually will slowly turn into a meadow and then back into a forest and reconnect corridors for wildlife as part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And so luckily these renderings, these conversations locally using economics and the environmental benefits has changed the conversation, and as well as the fishery impact. By just opening up the migratory fish pattern for these fish to come back up the Ocklawaha River and spawn will increase populations of American shad, American eel, which was the #1 fishery in Palatka many years ago before the dam. Also striped bass. This past a couple months, you've seen striped bass trying to get into the Ocklawaha, but they were stopped by the dam. And of course, Atlantic sturgeon, which would be exciting to see them come back into the St. Johns River. It's also the most important thing to restore Silver Springs. It's a critical part to bring Silver Springs back to its heyday. Back, I know when I first saw it in the 70s, it was much more blue and clear with many more fish and different types of fish. Now it has a green tint, and you don't see nearly as many fish, as well as there's significant algae issues. And then, as I mentioned, it restores 20 springs that right now are lost, that are underneath the pool, that are drowned out. And it's a permanent lifeline to our manatees who are struggling in the state with loss of habitat, as well as loss of warm water habitat, which is important in the wintertime. And then what's really exciting is we did a scientific poll to ask people who live in Putnam and Marion counties their opinion, and 77% support restoration. The politicians said, well, wait a minute, this is Marion County. What about Putnam County? We did another poll just in Putnam County, and 74% of most likely voters in Putnam County support restoration. So we're making some headway. Real quickly, before I open it up for questions, I did want to talk about the cost of pollution. The other part of the work we do, besides trying to restore the river's ability to filter out pollution and give us wonderful fisheries, is stopping pollution at its source. It's so much cheaper to ensure that pollution doesn't go in than trying to take it out afterwards. One of the biggest examples of that is our failed sewage sludge policy in the state of Florida. Right now, the state of Florida does not have a sustainable plan to manage our growing volume of waste. We have way too many septic tanks, but as we take septic tanks offline and send them to our wastewater treatment facilities, those treatment facilities and utilities have to do something with sewage sludge. Sewage sludge is that really dark black material you see there. It's highly concentrated human waste that's commingled with industrial waste, and it's concentrated all the different things that you don't want, why you wouldn't want sewage in your waterways. The utilities have to dispose of this some way in a cheap fashion, and the cheapest way for them to do it is to dispose of it on land as fertilizer. But this practice has significant pollution issues, and this was banned in South Florida. So South Florida cannot dispose of their sewage sludge on land. So now they're sending it to Central and North Florida, and 80% of this concentrated human waste is going in the headwaters of the St. Johns on farmland is as fertilizer. When you put this on your farm, if you're a farmer, you do get a rich nitrogen and phosphorus for your crops. It's mostly grass for cattle. But you have to get enough nitrogen, you have to put 10 times as much phosphorus on just due to the natural ratio of this sewage sludge. And we're seeing, as a result, significant runoff of phosphorus in the lower St. John, the upper St. Johns and the headwaters that's impacting us all the way down to the lower St. Johns. Recently, we did an economic study of what this costs to downstream communities, and it's a $200 to $300 million impact to downstream communities, because once this pollution goes in, the downstream communities are responsible for getting it out. And so it's a significant problem. We were able to convince the state to have more protective rules, but they're still allowing South Florida to send their human waste and saddle all of us in the St. Johns River watershed, which we believe is highly unfair. But now we have an economic number to show not only that, it's shifting their responsibility to clean up their own waste on all of us in the watershed. So we're continuing to work on this effort, but we're growing in the state of Florida at 1,000 people per day. That means we have a growing volume of sewage, and right now there's not a plan to manage it sustainably or effectively, and that's a crime for all of us now and for tomorrow that needs to be corrected. And then conserving water. Our water is precious in the state of Florida. We are outpacing and outgrowing what our aquifer is providing us, and that's detrimental to our springs as well. We've seen a 30% reduction of spring flow into the St. Johns, and so we need to do our part. We're still putting 50% of our drinking water and our spring water on our grass, and the state's not taking water conservation seriously. We need to incentivize water conservation, we need to educate about it, and we need to regulate it. It's a three-pronged stool that we need to focus on protecting our precious water resources for the future and for our springs. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you all to answer any questions that you may have. Everything I talked about today, you can find at stjohnsriverkeeper.org. We also have the explorethestjohns.com if you want to find great places to go explore the river with ideas there. We have a great paddle coming up on the Ocklawaha with Lars Anderson and other outings coming up, so we'd love to see you out on the water. But I'm going to ask Bob to help me facilitate any questions that you all have. But thank you so much for your time and the opportunity to talk about the St. Johns today.
I think we first have to say, wow. Yeah. That was wonderful, Lisa. There must be some questions. I see 1, 2, 3 hand.
Hi, thanks very much. What alternatives are there for the sludge that's coming out of South Florida?
So right now there's 3 options. They either landfill it, and it's not ideal landfill material either because it's kind of squishy. It's too squishy for a landfill. Or they treat it further and turn it into a commercial, it's clean enough to sell as commercial fertilizer. That's not perfect either, because one of the problems with that is that they could just dump it on farmland and it's not regulated. So some of our friends in South Florida, they get really nervous about that because they have protections in the Everglades area that we don't have. There is a new a new plant in Martin County that's using it's an old technology, but using it a new way to turn it into a biofuel, and that should come online soon. And the water management districts are looking at other options to treat it more, to turn it into something that truly is beneficial without these unintended consequences. One thing that's, I hate to say it's working in our favor right now because I hate to say that out loud, because one of the things that's helping us get rid of the farms dumping this on their land is it's also known the chemistry of it makes these forever chemicals stick to these biosolids. So some of these farms are now contaminated with forever chemicals. Deseret Ranch has been one of the largest farms that has accept this, and they won't take it anymore because of that. So it's getting to a crisis level, but there are technologies that exist that can turn it into a more beneficial fuel without the unintended consequences, and that will be online very soon.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm just wondering what the reality is, in your opinion, of their getting rid of the dam.
Well, I think we're closer than we've ever been right now, thanks to this group of business and elected officials in the local counties in partnership with fishing groups and others. We're seeing support in the legislature, so there's support in the House and the Senate. But if you've been paying attention to what's going on in Tallahassee right now, there is a pretty significant tension between the governor's office and the legislature. So that's our greatest fear right now, is that tension could undermine the effort. But I do believe right now there is support within both houses of the legislature. So we're closer than we ever been. But once we'll know by the end of June if it survives the interesting dynamics and drama in Tallahassee.
Could you comment about Nestle Bottling Company drawing millions of gallons from the aquifer when fresh water is so important to the St. Johns River?
Sure, Bob, do you want to take that one? Right. So Bob and I are both on the Florida Springs Council, and luckily the Florida Springs Council fought that permit and did lose the lawsuit. And that's one of, gosh, how many bottling permits? There are others too. And it's part of, needing to have that overall, there doesn't seem to be any sort of real cap on protecting our aquifer. One of the things they're starting to do right now is just going deeper in the aquifer and say, oh, we're going to go in, in the deep aquifer. Well, it's all the same. It's all connected. You also hear a lot of conversation about alternative water supply, which is really robbing Peter to pay Paul. So it's the Nestle thing. It was a sad loss. It's just emblematic of the problem we have right now protecting our water supply, and the laws don't really prevent harm, as we unfortunately know. Bob, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, we did sue on the Nestle permit, Maurice, which was 1 million gallons a day. I think the judge ruled correctly in that the permit did comply with the rules, the Water Management District rules. The problem is the rules are awful. The rules supposedly, one of the functions of the rules is, quote, to protect the, what do they call it, the public interest. That permit was not in the public interest. We had 19,000 comments from the public saying they didn't want this permit approved. That would seem to reflect the public interest. The judge ignored that. So the next step would be to actually challenge the rule that allowed the permit to be issued. And if we get enough money and time and smart lawyers, we will do that at some point. Yeah, Nestle, well, it's not Nestle anymore. It's Blue Triton or some new entity that bought them out. And they do have to pay for the water, and it's extremely significant. They had to pay, I think it's $135. And that covers 20 years of water pumping. So that's a real dent in the corporate bottom line, $135.
Hi, I'm Phyllis Sarna, and I happen to be a retired water resource economist. And in the process of getting my master's degree, I did an intensive study of the Water Resources Act of 1972 and its intent, and the people who, the law professors who drafted that, um, really envisioned something quite different than what's turned out. We have what we used to call political administrative water system here. So in fact, the sale of water in Florida is prohibited. It's not legal. So what is happening with that Nestle permit is that the people who own the land and who apply for the permit then have a transaction where they sell the right to the water to Nestle. And in my mind, that's illegal. Water is defined as a public resource in this state. And anyway, that's part of the problem. It's a very complex situation. So thank you for allowing me to have a few minutes here.
Thank you for that. It is extremely complicated, and one of the things that happened in 2011, I think, the legislature changed the burden of proof, where it used to have to be the people trying to get a permit had to prove they weren't harming the resources. Now we as citizens have to. And there have been even since then, more and more things trying to prevent us as citizens to use the law and the tools we have, threatening. They tried to do a slap suit against us with a fight in Seminole County. And luckily we won, but there's other examples where environmental groups weren't so lucky and they're out of business now, and they can go after individuals. So as Bob's point, we have to protect the laws that give us the ability and the rules that give us the ability to protect these resources. And right now, the state and the legislature, they see the permitted world as their customers and not us as citizens. And I think that's a huge problem.
I grew up on the St. John's in Jacksonville. And when I was growing up, raw sewage was discharged in a pipe near our home, actually, which was bad because I had a sailboat anchored out, in front of the house, and had to wade through all this stuff. I gather that's now corrected, and I wondered what the impact has been with the no longer discharging raw sewage.
Yes, well, good question. We are happy to report that they are not pumping raw sewage in the St. John's intentionally. We still find leaks at times. At one point, the city of Jacksonville was pumping 15 million gallons of raw sewage in the St. John's. And so there has been a significant improvement, reduction of bacteria as well as nutrients. What we are seeing, though, in some of the tributaries, we're still having significant bacteria issues due to failing septic tanks, as well as old infrastructure, leaky pipes that they're trying to figure out how to address. Right now, they wait till it fails, and there's a significant failure. There's no proactive way. So we're seeing improvement with the big pipes, that where they've been able to treat that water. But now we have the sewage sludge issue, so it's kind of playing whack-a-mole because they're using sewage sludge and they're disposing it in land. And also some of the recharge, we're using reclaimed water on our grasses and on medians, and we're seeing significant nutrient pollution runoff in those areas too, and sometimes bacteria. So it's not perfected yet, it's better, but we're not keeping up with the growing volume. And so we're going to, unless we get more protections in place, we're going to have more algae outbreaks. We're going to have less seagrass, less eelgrass. And so we're still on a slippery slope, but it is better.
This kind of reminds me of a giant jigsaw puzzle, and somebody's always stealing a few pieces, so you can never get it together. But I'm going to mention Lake Apopka, the Kissimmee River, the Rodman Dam, the St. John's. Nobody listened to the people who said it's cheaper to not do it than to try to fix it, And now we've spent as taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars to restore Lake Apopka. We have spent the same for unstraightening the Kissimmee River. And so they learned nothing from the Kissimmee by straightening the St. John's in that area. But it all boils down, obviously, it's known to everybody in this room. It's who's in political power, how and when you get these, like 1972, the water quality, or the outstanding Florida waters, that kind of thing. So I guess all I can say is when you vote, find out what they stand for your futures and your kids as far as the environment, clean air, clean water, whatever. So thank you for the rant.
Well, thank you, Pat. And you're exactly right. It's all about, one of the most important things we can do is vote and also hold them accountable to what they stand for. As a 501c3, we can't endorse candidates, but we do candidate surveys. So we ask where they stand on these issues, and then we use their answers. We share their answers with the public, but then we can also hold them accountable at what they stand for after the fact. But a lot of politicians have a short memory. They seem to forget some things that they promised on the campaign trail when they get involved.
And I'll interrupt Bob, but I'd like to comment that sometimes you say that you want to reduce the sources, and people will say, well, that's expensive, which is why the information that you presented today, the benefits of that in dollars, and you can't say, well, we want to protect the fish, and they say, well, yeah, but it costs $100 million to upgrade the sewer treatment plant. Well, if the fishing is worth $100 million a year, that's 100% return per year. That's the big deal. Yeah. So thank you for all the economic stuff.
First of all, I want to compliment you on using the term sewage sludge, because that's what it is. It's gross, it's yicky. The state calls it biosolids, which sounds like something you put on your cereal. And that's very intentional of the state to make it sound kind of harmless. So bless you for calling it what it is, because a lot of environmentalists have sort of fallen into the trap of calling it biosolids, which is really misleading. I don't have a question, but I'd like you to expound a little more about, and this is an illustration of how all these things are connected. Joe asked about the Ross sewage going out in the St. Johns River. We now have this proposal to take the wastewater from the Jacksonville utility and use it to recharge the springs, which may surprise some people in this room, but it just shows how everything's interconnected. Could you discuss that proposal briefly?
Absolutely. And I will say there's a college marketing textbook that has a whole chapter on biosolids and how they change that name to make people think it sounds good. But it's highly concentrated sewage sludge. Some people use other words. I'm trying to get an acronym that works. But yes, there is a proposal right now. There was a bill that passed the legislature several years ago that are telling utilities they have to use their discharge. So after they clean the sewage, they take out the sewage sludge, they do discharge water into water bodies, or they use it for reclaimed water. So they either have to use it for reclaimed water or they have to use it in some beneficial way in accordance with this law. And what JEA in Jacksonville is proposing is they're going to pipe about 50 million gallons a day to the west side of Duval County and discharge it into a wetland designed to treat it more, and then do another pipe to pump it closer to Santa Fe and Itchitucknee to recharge that spring shed. And the goal is to reduce the impact of pumping from the Jacksonville area. Right now it's drawing down on the Santa Fe and Itchitucknee, so it's reduced that impact. But it also allows for the agencies to do more permitting of more houses and more growth. And so it's not all done just for, the spring. There's some ulterior motives involved, but it allows them to get rid of to be in compliance with the law, to pump it out west, and then to recharge. Count that as benefit of the spring so there can be more growth. Is there anything I missed you want to? I'm sorry. Oh, and anyone want to guess how much it cost? $800 million to do this. I think probably all of us in this room could come up with better ideas to protect our springs and deal with this water that's $800 million. So it's part of a shell game. There's also other issues like forever chemicals and PFAS, and while it can be done in a wetlands treatment, there's just some things that obviously need our attention to. We did meet recently with Dr. Bob Knight, who actually proposed a similar idea to this, and he says they could do it better for a lot less based on his plan. So there'll be more conversation about that. But the concern is it's about allowing more development in these sensitive areas where there's much more effective, impactful ways to reduce impact to those springs. For example, maybe discharging it into taking agriculture that's highly negatively impacting these waterways, taking that offline and using that turning that into wetlands would be helpful. So stay tuned. That bill, there's a bill kind of getting it in the right position where it will be in the public interest, but I'm not sure where the $800 million is coming from. Yes.
Just a quick question. There's strength in numbers.
Yes.
Are you coordinating with the Charlotte Harbor Waterkeepers or Caloosahatchee Waterkeepers in getting all of you together to make these proposals? Because they are having the same issues.
Absolutely. In fact, we united formally in 2018 as Waterkeepers Florida because we realized that these issues are all impactful, our waterways, and most of these decisions are made at the state level. And so we can unite. There's 15 of us together that work at the state level, and we meet every week on issues during the legislative session, as well as we meet ongoing. We just developed our first formal strategic plan to get more aggressive out front because we've been reactive. We want to be more proactive. And it's also a great way just to have support. Some of these times getting together and just having moral support and learning from one another, but also elevating our voice at the state level has been really meaningful and impactful. So the question for those of you online was, how could you help? Well, this is the first step, having this conversation. We, along with our other water keepers, we do call to actions during the legislative session. Florida Springs Council also does calls to action. If you're not on one of our email lists, we can make that happen where you get emails where it's just maybe making a phone call. Or sending an email and not representing necessarily, not calling on behalf of the St. Johns River, but calling on behalf of yourself as a citizen who cares about clean water makes a huge difference. So during the legislative session, that's a great way, and we can make that happen where you get those alerts right away via email. And then also, just sharing river-friendly practices on how we all can make a difference in our individual lives and reporting things. If you see a bad law or you see a bad issue, maybe it's a development that's not on our radar, but it's going to impact a spring, just keeping eyes and ears and reporting them to either us or your local waterkeeper or the Florida Springs Council is really important because we can't be everywhere at all times.
One of your pieces of information that you didn't bring out verbally, orally, was that 50% of the treated water supply is used for lawn irrigation. Now, that's something that could be changed much more economically than going through all these complicated disposal options, and that is reclaimed water. I live in a community locally that supplies treated reclaimed water for irrigation, free of cost. They don't charge us for it. I think it was part of the original development agreement. So I was on the City Water Management Committee in the late 90s. And I was surprised to discover that GRU did not have a very strong stepped billing rate, i.e. the more water you use, the more expensive per 1,000 gallons it becomes. So I pushed that, and lo and behold, they actually changed their billing structure and put on the bill that people could see why their water was increasing, because they were watering their lawns with potable water. Why has the reclaimed water option not been further explored in Jacksonville, for example?
Sure. The challenge in Jacksonville, according to JEA, is there's has such old infrastructure, and not only are the wastewater treatment facilities spread out, they're also the old communities and the old pipes. They would have to go in, and to repipe them for reclaimed water, they would have to kill trees and dig new pipes. And so they are pushing reclaimed water in all the new development, but they're unable to do it cost effectively within the older neighborhoods and the existing before those neighborhoods went in place. So I forgot the percentages of what they do. They did do a tiered billing like you were successful to do here in Gainesville, but it's not as impactful. It's very minor, and you don't really feel it unless someone points it out, and that's an area for improvement. So they have pushed back. JEA, they did have some big wastewater treatment facilities, and then they did smaller ones and regional ones, and so it's also spread out. They say it's not cost effective or reasonable for them to do it. But I can't imagine it's $800 million. You think it would be able to do something for that. That's why I think the ulterior motive for that investment is part of allowing more development in those areas, which is going to undermine any potential impact that pipeline could have. Same with the Keystone pipe. They just built a pipe to pump 10 million gallons a day from Black Creek over to the Keystone Lakes. And all the lakes folks are like, yay, it's going to help our lakes. But they also, at the same time, are allowing more development. And if you read the fine print, it says it may help the lakes. Well, not if they continue to allow more pumping. You've got to do both. And so there's not a holistic approach to protecting our freshwater sources. Any example that I've seen that's sustainable across the state.
Any other questions in the room? Pam, any questions online? Wow, I think we should thank Lisa for a wonderful talk. It was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you so much.